By the time he left the White House, a typical family in Texas, for example, would have to pay an additional $12,427 every year just to maintain the same standard of living that they had enjoyed when President Biden first took office. So that's like getting a $12,427 pay cut each year for the average Texas family. Last November, when President Trump was reelected, 58% of Americans said they thought the country was on the wrong track. So it's no surprise that they voted for a new direction. Actually, I think two things helped President Trump the most. One was his pledge to secure the border, which he's done. And secondly, his pledge to deal with this issue of rising.
Let me watch you squirm as you witness your senator of choice standing there spouting absolute garbage to your face as if you were born yesterday, as if you have the memory of a goldfish swimming in circles, convinced that everything bad started when Biden walked through those White House doors. Everything good began the moment Trump returned like some kind of economic messiah descended from Mar-a-Lago to rescue struggling Texas families from the Democrats' inflationary hellscape. And here's the thing that should make your blood absolutely boil. Because this is the big reveal. Nobody in the Republican establishment wants you to grasp fully. From January 2021 through January 2025, wages rose 19.9%, while prices rose 21.5%. Meaning average hourly earnings adjusted for inflation declined by 1.3% during these 4 years, which sounds terrible until you realize what actually happened during this period, because wait for it, here comes the bombshell that destroys their entire narrative from the foundation up. Global supply chain disruptions following the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic contributed to the rapid rise in U.S. inflation over the past 2 years. And you know what that means in plain English, stripped of all the Republican gaslighting. It means the vast majority of the inflation surge was driven by supply-linked factors, not by the demand side that would point to overheating and excessive policy stimulus, which completely obliterates the conservative talking point that Biden's spending caused this crisis, because the actual economic research from institutions that aren't funded by billionaire think tanks tells us these factors accounted for about 60% of the surge in U.S. inflation beginning in early 2021. Meaning this senator is standing there blaming Biden for a global phenomenon that hit every developed economy on the planet regardless of who was in charge or what their fiscal policies looked like. And speaking of those policies, let's talk about what Republicans actually did versus what they're claiming now, because this is where the hypocrisy becomes so thick you could cut it with a knife. The corporate profiteering angle that progressives have been screaming about for years while being dismissed as economically illiterate socialists. After-tax profits for corporations continued to climb year after year under Biden, setting new records each time, increasing to about $2.9 trillion in 2021, to $3 trillion in 2022, to $3.2 trillion in 2023, and to roughly $3.5 trillion in 2024, with profits up about 58.2% from 2020. So let me get this straight because the math here is absolutely devastating to the Republican position. Corporations are posting record profits year after year after year, while simultaneously raising prices and blaming inflation, an overwhelming 80% majority of Americans already recognize. According to a recent poll that under the guise of inflation, certain corporations excessively hiked prices far beyond what their costs necessitated, further driving inflation, which means regular people understand what's happening even if Republican senators pretend corporate greed is some fringe conspiracy theory invented by Elizabeth Warren in a fever dream. Here's what your Republican senator conveniently forgets to mention when he's tallying up the supposed damage from Bidenflation while promising you that Trump will fix everything. And this is the part that should make you want to throw something at your television because the audacity is breathtaking. Trump's tariffs amount to an average tax increase of $1,000 per U.S. household in 2025, and now the weighted average applied tariff rate on all imports rises to 15.8% under the tariffs imposed, the highest average rate since 1943, making them the largest U.S. tax increase as a percent of GDP since 1993. So the same political party that's been crying about Biden hurting American families has imposed what amounts to a massive regressive tax that hits working families the hardest, because tariffs are paid by importers and passed along to consumers, meaning Trump's signature economic policy is literally making everything more expensive right now as we speak, with tariffs increasing the inflation rate by 0.7 percentage points between March and August, according to recent research. But sure, let's pretend Trump is the inflation fighter while Biden was the inflation creator, as if we're all idiots incapable of reading economic data or remembering what happened 5 minutes ago. The beautiful part about conservative economic rhetoric is how it relies entirely on you not knowing anything about recent history or having access to actual economic analysis, because if you did, you'd realize tax cuts initially enacted during Republican trifectas in the past 25 years slashed taxes disproportionately for the wealthy and profitable corporations, severely reducing federal revenues, adding $10 trillion to the debt since their enactment, and accounting for more than 90% of the increase in the debt ratio, if you exclude the one-time costs for responding to COVID-19 and the Great Recession, which means every single time Republicans get power they immediately slash taxes for their wealthy donors while exploding the deficit. Then the moment Democrats take over, they start screaming about fiscal responsibility and the national debt, as if they weren't the ones who created the problem in the first place through massive giveaways to people who absolutely did not need them. Let's dig into what Trump's beautiful tax policies actually accomplished, since your senator wants to credit him with saving families. And prepare yourself, because this is infuriating. The top 0.6% of people, the 1.2 million people with annual incomes above $1 million, would receive more total tax cuts than the 127 million people with incomes below $100,000 under Republican tax proposals, while the top 1% would receive tax cuts 3 times the size of those for people with incomes in the bottom 60%, measured as a share of after-tax income. And just so we're absolutely clear about who benefits from Republican economic policy, the state and local tax deduction substantially increases from $10,000, and wealthy Americans get a higher lifetime exemption for estate and gift taxes starting next year, meaning the party that claims to represent working families just handed massive permanent tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires while offering crumbs to everyone else. And this isn't even getting into the obscene reality that the exemption has been made permanent at $15 million per individual and $30 million per married couple for estate taxes. The ultra-wealthy can pass down generational fortunes without paying their fair share, while your senator stands there pretending Republicans care about the Texas family struggling with grocery bills. The Democratic response to corporate price gouging has been legislative action that Republicans predictably block at every turn, with progressives like Warren and Baldwin reintroducing the Price Gouging Prevention Act to fight back against corporate greed, enabled by Trump's chaotic tariff policies, giving the Federal Trade Commission and state attorneys general new tools to enforce a federal ban against grossly excessive price increases, because the last 5 years have repeatedly shown us that giant corporations will take advantage of inflation and supply chain disruptions to expand their profit margins by raising prices higher than necessary to cover cost increases, which is exactly what happened, but Republicans refuse to address because their entire economic worldview is built on the premise that corporate power must never be challenged under any circumstances, no matter how much suffering it causes ordinary people. Now we arrive at the truly maddening part of this whole charade, which is that the new presidential administration is inheriting an economy that demonstrates significant continued strength, with real gross domestic product exceeding major public and private forecasts in both 2023 and 2024. Meaning Biden is literally handing Trump a strong economy that has weathered unprecedented global disruptions better than virtually any other developed nation. But you will never hear a Republican senator acknowledge this reality because it destroys their carefully constructed narrative that Democrats are incompetent managers who wreck everything they touch, while Republicans swoop in to save the day, when the actual historical record shows the exact opposite pattern playing out over and over again across decades of American political economy. The voter perception problem that ultimately doomed Biden and the Democrats in the 2024 election reveals something deeply troubling about how economic pain gets translated into political outcomes, because inflation and its onerous burden on households, particularly those at the lower end of the income spectrum, dwarfed all the other good that happened on Biden's watch, and the 19% increase in average hourly earnings under Biden is still below the inflation rate even with a pickup in 2024, which means people really did experience a decline in purchasing power during a period when overall inflation was 21.2% during the 4 years Biden was in office. But here's the crucial context that Republican rhetoric deliberately obscures. During Trump's first presidential term, earnings rose by less than under Biden, but inflation was far lower, so the typical family got ahead, except that completely ignores the reality that Trump's first term happened during a historically unusual period of low inflation that was ending regardless of who was president. Trump's first presidential term was likely the last of a low-inflation era that ran from 1990 to 2020, with Trump benefiting from an energy boom driven by new fracking technology, meaning he got lucky with timing while Biden inherited a perfect storm of global disruptions. What Republicans are doing right now is so transparently cynical it should offend anyone with even a passing commitment to intellectual honesty, because they spent the Biden years screaming about inflation and claiming his spending was destroying the economy. Then the moment they regained power, they immediately passed massive tax cuts, including making permanent the 20% deduction for pass-through income, a provision alone costing $737 billion through 2034, with around half of its benefits going to households with more than $1 million in income, while simultaneously imposing tariffs that economists across the political spectrum agree are inflationary, with Trump's tariff policies slowing economic growth in the United States and around the world while sending prices higher again, according to the OECD, creating exactly the kind of economic damage they spent years accusing Democrats of causing. The supply chain analysis that serious economists have been conducting reveals that by 2022, the main driver of inflation shifted from supply chain shocks to constraints on productive capacity, likely due to reduced levels of labor supply, and in late 2022, inflation began to decline as a result of weakened demand, strengthened capacity, and supply chain recovery, which means the inflationary period was a complex global phenomenon driven by pandemic disruptions, supply chain breakdowns, shifts in consumer behavior, and labor market dynamics, none of which Biden personally caused, and all of which would have happened regardless of who occupied the White House. But good luck getting a Republican to admit that when they can instead blame everything on Democratic spending and promise that tax cuts for billionaires will somehow make your groceries cheaper. The research on this is actually quite clear for anyone willing to look at it honestly, with studies finding that supply chain disruptions during the COVID-19 pandemic recession and recovery were unprecedented, with the shift in demand toward durable goods consumption and heavy reliance on foreign suppliers creating a mismatch between supply and demand, resulting in price increases, and sectors that relied more heavily on foreign inputs from countries that faced stronger disruptions experienced larger increases in inflation, meaning this was fundamentally a supply-side crisis, not a demand-side crisis, which completely undermines the Republican argument that Biden's fiscal stimulus was the primary culprit, although you'll notice they never let facts get in the way of a good attack line that polls well with voters who understandably feel economic pain but don't have time to dig through economic research papers to understand its actual causes. Here's what makes the Republican position even more offensive once you understand what they're actually proposing as solutions, because while they claim to care about families struggling with costs, under their tax bill, the average family earning less than $50,000 would get under $300 in tax cuts in 2027, less than $1 a day, while the average tax filer earning $1 million or more a year would receive about $90,000 in tax breaks, and to add insult to injury, 17 million children who currently don't get the full child tax credit because their families' incomes are too low get nothing from the $500 per child increase, meaning up to 20 million children are in working families that get no help at all or get less than the full amount because they don't earn enough, while a married couple with 2 children earning $400,000 a year would receive an extra $1,000, which perfectly encapsulates Republican priorities in a single policy, giving massive benefits to the wealthy while leaving behind the people who actually need help the most. The corporate profit story during this period deserves constant repetition because it reveals everything you need to know about who really benefited from inflation and who bore the costs, and I want you to really sit with this because it should radicalize you. Certain corporations are using the cover of inflation to raise prices excessively, resulting in record profits and profit margins, and beginning in 2021, certain corporations began enjoying record profits and profit margins and continue to do so today. Studies by the Economic Policy Institute and Roosevelt Institute demonstrate that profits contributed more to price growth in the United States from mid-2020 through the end of 2021 than at any other point from 1979 to the present, and continue to contribute markedly today, which means corporations saw an opportunity to jack up prices beyond what rising costs justified, pocketed the difference as record profits, then watched as Republican politicians blamed the whole thing on Democratic fiscal policy while proposing solutions that would further enrich the same corporations that were price gouging in the first place. The tariff situation under Trump is developing into exactly the kind of inflationary disaster that Democrats warned about, with the price of imported goods rising about 4.0% between March and September 2025, while domestic goods rose 2.0%, and the average tax on U.S. imports today, nearly 18% up from 2.4% before Trump returned to the White House, with the Treasury Department collecting almost 4 times as much tariff revenue now as a year ago, and despite the administration's repeated claims that foreign suppliers are paying the tariffs, most of the bill is being paid by U.S. importers, and ultimately at least some of the tab will be passed along to American consumers in the form of higher prices, which means Trump is literally imposing a massive regressive tax on American families right now, while Republicans pretend he's the solution to inflation, rather than actively making it worse. The economic policy debate in this country has become completely untethered from reality, thanks to Republican messaging that relies on voters having the memory span of a fruit fly, because they want you to forget that the 2001, 2003, and 2017 tax cuts were all deficit financed, and because they were enacted during times of aggregate demand slack, they did not drag on economic growth and in fact provided some useful macroeconomic stimulus in those years. But this stimulus was extremely inefficient when graded in terms of economic activity generated per dollar increase in the deficit, since measures that transfer money to low and moderate income households are far more efficient stimulus, meaning even when Republican tax cuts achieve something positive, it's by accident, and they could have helped far more people with the same money if they weren't ideologically committed to showering benefits on the wealthy. But today the U.S. does not need macroeconomic stimulus. With unemployment at or below 4.2% since November 2021, the longest stretch of unemployment this low since the Vietnam War, and both inflation and interest rates substantially higher in 2024 than during previous Republican tax cuts, which means the economic context is completely different, and these tax cuts will likely be actively harmful, rather than merely wasteful. The international comparison here is instructive, because inflation hit virtually every developed economy during this period, proving this was a global phenomenon, not a uniquely American policy failure, but Republicans have successfully convinced huge portions of the electorate that Biden personally caused your grocery bill to go up through some combination of reckless spending and generic Democratic incompetence, when the reality is that given unprecedented supply chain disruptions, it is increasingly consensus that pandemic-era inflation was largely supply-driven, with firms' margins only beginning to normalize, underscoring the long-lasting effects of COVID-19 disruptions, and the vast majority of the COVID-19 inflation surge is accounted for by supply-linked factors, especially a rise in company margins that followed severe delivery delays at the height of the pandemic, while demand-linked factors like indicators of labor market overheating play almost no role, meaning the argument that policy stimulus was excessive is weak, but again, facts are negotiable when your entire political strategy is built on exploiting economic anxiety for electoral gain. What we're witnessing is a textbook case of how conservative economic messaging operates in complete bad faith, blaming Democrats for global phenomena beyond any president's control, proposing solutions that exclusively benefit wealthy donors while doing nothing for working families, implementing policies like tariffs that actively make inflation worse, then pointing to the resulting problems as evidence that Democrats can't be trusted with the economy. And the most maddening part is that it works because most voters understandably don't have time to become amateur economists, capable of sorting through competing claims about supply chain disruptions versus demand-side overheating versus corporate profiteering versus fiscal stimulus, so they just know their paychecks don't go as far as they used to, and they vote accordingly, which is exactly what Republicans are counting on when they stand there and lie directly to your face about who's responsible and what the solutions should be, and that senator blaming Biden for a Texas family's financial struggles while supporting massive tax cuts for millionaires and tariffs that raise prices is participating in one of the most cynical political cons in American history, exploiting real economic pain to advance an agenda that will make that pain worse for the people who need help most while enriching those who need help least. Demand better from your elected representatives and better economic literacy from your media sources and better organizing from your progressive movement, then I don't know what will, because the stakes here are not just about one election or one president or one senator's talking points. They're about whether we're going to build an economy that works for everyone, or continue down this path where corporations post record profits while families struggle and Republican politicians blame Democrats for problems caused by global forces and corporate greed, then propose solutions that somehow always involve more money for billionaires and less help for everyone else. And I'm done pretending that's anything other than exactly what it looks like, which is a deliberate, systematic effort to transfer wealth upward while convincing working people to blame the wrong culprits for their declining living standards.